Imagine being handed a death sentence. And not because of a crime you committed,
Right.
not because of a war you started, but literally just because of a centuries-old mistranslation.
It's staggering when you really think about it.
It really is. Like, for the Yazidi people, they had this profoundly beautiful theological concept of divine stewardship,
Yeah.
right? And it was twisted by outsiders into this horrifying accusation.
Yeah, completely inverted.
Exactly. It was basically a deadly game of telephone, one that took a symbol of absolute obedience to God and, well, labeled it as the devil worship.
Which is just...
And that single catastrophic misunderstanding became the foundation for centuries of violence, culminating in the industrialized horrors we all saw on the news in 2014.
Right, the ISIS genocide.
So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a really comprehensive document today called Yazidis.pdf. It's this massive collection of historical data, sociological analysis, psychological profiling.
It's incredibly dense.
Very dense. All regarding the Yazidi people and the persecution they've endured. And the goal of this deep dive isn't just to recount a tragic history. We are going to reverse engineer a persecutory machine.
I like that phrasing, a machine.
Because that's what it is, right? By unpacking exactly how the Yazidis were targeted, from the height of the Ottoman Empire down to the sudden, brutal rise of ISIS, you are going to learn how to spot the recurring formulas of prejudice.
Exactly.
We're looking at the exact mechanics of how isolation and exploitation manage to turn ordinary, everyday humans into functioning cogs within a violent administrative system.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because while the subject matter we're dealing with today is incredibly heavy, it offers a crucial blueprint. It shows us step by step how hate makes that terrifying leap from a private, internal belief into an organized, lethal reality.
And you know, what's fascinating here is that when we look back at history, we naturally gravitate toward clean, single-cause explanation.
Oh, totally. We want it to be simple.
Right. When we see a vulnerable group targeted, we desperately want to say, oh, it's just ancient religious hatred, or it's just inevitable tribal warfare.
It's easier to digest that way.
Exactly. It feels safer to believe that atrocities are driven by pure, irrational evil, but the reality is far more calculated.
Yeah.
Prejudice on its own is actually quite common, and it usually just remains a localized social issue, but it only becomes systematically lethal when three very specific elements perfectly align:
Which are?
ideology, incentive, and opportunity.
Ideology, incentive, opportunity.
Got it. And to understand how that alignment happened to the Yazidis, we can't just look at the violence itself. We have to start at the absolute root of the misunderstanding.
Exactly. Because before we can understand how this machine of persecution operated, we have to understand the people it was operating against. The core of this entire tragedy starts with theology.
Or, well, a fatal misinterpretation of it.
Right. So break that down for us. What is the actual belief?
Okay, so the Yazidis possess an incredibly rich, ancient religious tradition. It's indigenous to the Middle East, mostly concentrated in the regions of northern Iraq, around Mount Sinjar.
Okay.
And central to their entire belief system is their reverence for a figure known as Melek Taus, which translates to the peacock angel.
The peacock angel.
All right. So in Yazidi theology, God created the world and then entrusted its care to 7 holy beings, or angels. And Melek Taus is the chief of these angels.
So he's like the primary steward?
Yes, exactly. He is a figure of divine stewardship. Now, the story goes that God tested Melek Taus by commanding him to bow to the newly created Adam.
Right.
But Melek Taus refused. He stated that he would bow only to the supreme creator and nothing else.
Which, in their framework, is the ultimate test of loyalty, right? Like,
Okay.
He passed the test by refusing to worship anything other than God.
Precisely. In the Yazidi tradition, this refusal is viewed as an act of absolute, unwavering obedience and devotion. Because of that loyalty, God placed Melek Taus in charge of the earth. He's associated with restoration, the natural order, the bringing of light.
It's a really beautiful concept.
It is. But you have to remember the geographical and cultural context the Yazidis were living in. They were entirely surrounded by dominant Abrahamic traditions.
Right. Judaism, Christianity, Islam.
Exactly.
And in those Abrahamic frameworks, the story of an angel refusing to bow to humanity has a very, very different ending.
It has the exact opposite meaning.
Yeah.
In the Abrahamic traditions, the narrative of a powerful central angel who refuses God's command to bow to Adam, well, that maps directly onto the concept of Satan, or Iblis in the Islamic tradition.
Right. It's the ultimate story of pride and rebellion.
Yes, the fall from grace. So you have these outsiders looking at Yazidi theology, but they're viewing it strictly through the rigid lens of their own religion.
Oh, I see.
They heard the story of Melek Tawis, projected their own theological villain onto it, and completely misinterpreted this figure of divine stewardship as a fallen angel.
That is,
And from that projection, they slapped the Yazidis with this manufactured, completely false label of devil worshippers.
man, so it really was a deadly game of telephone.
Yeah.
Just a complete mistranslation that essentially painted a giant target on their backs for hundreds of years.
Literally hundreds of years.
But I have to push back slightly here just to understand the human behavior side of this.
Sure.
If you are a community, right, and you hear your neighbors calling you something that horrific, something that is entirely false and incredibly dangerous, why not just correct the record?
It's a fair question.
Right. Why didn't the Yazidi leadership just open their doors, invite the surrounding scholars in, and say, look, you've got this all wrong. Let us explain what we actually believe?
It's a completely logical question from a modern, interconnected perspective. But it completely ignores the brutal reality of how marginalized communities function in historical power dynamics.
What do you mean?
Well, first, the Yazidi traditions are deeply oral, and they are rigorously community preserved. They didn't have a mass-printed central text like a Bible or a Quran that they could simply hand out to their neighbors to clear up a misunderstanding.
Oh, right. So they couldn't just distribute a pamphlet?
Exactly. And furthermore, their decision not to openly share their teachings with outsiders wasn't an act of hostility or stubbornness. It was a carefully calculated protective measure.
Okay.
When you are a small minority group surrounded by massive, powerful, and often aggressive empires, insularity is your primary survival strategy.
You just keep your head down.
You keep your head down, you keep your beliefs internal, and you try your hardest not to draw attention to yourself.
But that protective measure, that silence, it actually backfired on a perceptual level, didn't it? Because human beings absolutely hate a vacuum of information.
Oh, we despise it. It created an intense information asymmetry. The Yazidis knew exactly what they believed, but the outsiders didn't.
And human psychology is just deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity.
Yes. We have this deeply ingrained distrust of what we cannot access or neatly categorize. Because the Yazidis were secretive, outsiders misread that lack of transparency as deceit.
Like, what are you hiding in there?
Exactly. The logic was, well, if they are hiding their rituals, they must be hiding something malicious. So the surrounding populations filled those information gaps with their own terrifying projections.
They invented monsters to put in the darkroom.
That's a great way to put it. They imagined dark rituals and sinister motives simply because they weren't allowed inside to see the mundane reality.
That is such a profound psychological mechanism. And it's something you see happen even today in different contexts, right?
All the time.
When people encounter an unfamiliar culture or unfamiliar theology or really any kind of deep ambiguity, they rarely suspend judgment.
Right, they don't just say, I don't know enough to form an opinion.
Exactly. They translate the unknown to fit their own worldview, and usually they assume the worst. They reduce a complex, nuanced reality into a simple binary us versus them narrative.
And for the Yazidis, this categorization had immediate material consequences. Because they didn't fit neatly into the accepted Abrahamic categories, they were placed completely outside the recognized moral order.
Meaning what, legally speaking?
Well, in early Islamic empires, there was a system called the dhimmi status. This provided legal protection and tolerance for people of the book, primarily Christians and Jews, provided they paid a specific tax.
Okay, so a protected class.
Right. But because of the devil worshipper myth, the Yazidis were often excluded from this protected category. They were classified as heretics or pagans.
Wow.
And that classification is the fundamental seed of all persecution. The moment a group is placed outside the moral and legal order of a society, harming them suddenly becomes legally permissible and socially acceptable.
So we have the foundational myth established. This deadly mistranslation placed them outside the boundaries of human protection.
Yes.
But a myth on its own is just a rumor. What the historical timeline in the source shows us is how this myth was picked up and utilized by different empires and actors over hundreds of years.
It became a tool.
Exactly. We see a distinct shift from a narrative of belief to a narrative of utility. Let's look at the Ottoman Empire era, because the flavor of the persecution changes drastically here. It's no longer just local clerics pointing fingers. It becomes a matter of state policy.
Yes, under the Ottoman Empire, the persecution became highly institutionalized. We see coordinated campaigns of forced assimilation, heavy state pressure, and periodic military massacres.
Brutal stuff.
But what is critical to understand is why the Ottomans were doing this. They didn't just view the Yazidis as religiously deviant, they viewed them as administratively inconvenient.
Administratively inconvenient. What does that actually look like on the ground? Because that sounds like a bureaucratic excuse for murder.
It basically was. The Ottoman state was this vast, sprawling empire that constantly needed to consolidate its power, standardize its laws, and most importantly, extract resources.
Right, they needed money and manpower.
Exactly. They needed to enforce taxation, and they needed to conscript young men into the imperial army. Now, the Yazidis lived primarily in the rugged, mountainous terrain of Sinjar.
Which is hard to reach.
Very hard. Geographically, they were isolated, and politically, they operated as a semi-autonomous community. They heavily resisted giving their wealth to Ottoman tax collectors, and they resisted sending their sons to die in Ottoman wars.
So they weren't dangerous in the sense that they were trying to overthrow the Sultan.
Not at all.
They were dangerous because they wouldn't conform to the bureaucracy. Like, if the empire can't categorize you and they can't reach you in the mountains, they can't control you.
Precisely. So the Ottoman military launched numerous campaigns into the Sinjar Mountains. And when they did, they used the religious deviation, that old devil worshiper myth, as the moral justification for the violence.
There it is.
Right. It sounded much better to the general public to say, we are marching to subdue the heretics, rather than saying, we are marching to force these poor mountain farmers to pay us more money.
Wow. So the religious myth provided the legal and moral cover, but the underlying mechanism driving the violence was purely political consolidation and imperial control.
Exactly. The core message from the state was, you are different, you are defiant, and your difference threatens the centralized order of the empire.
And then the history shifts again as we move into the 19th century, which the document often refers to as a peak phase of repression.
Yes, a very dark period.
But what's really wild to me is that during this period, the central Ottoman government actually gets much weaker. You would think a weaker empire means less persecution, but the violence actually gets worse. It just becomes highly localized.
This is a critical pivot in the mechanics of persecution. In the 19th century, as the Ottoman central control weakened, it created a massive power vacuum in the provinces.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
Right. And this allowed local power brokers, specifically powerful Kurdish emirs and heavily armed tribal forces, to rise to prominence. Without a strong central army to keep order, these local forces began launching brutal, devastating raids into Yazidi territory. They burned villages, forced conversions at sword point, and slaughtered thousands.
Just horrific. But the motive changed again, right?
Yes. The primary motive here shifted heavily away from religious purity and directly toward economic profit.
It was resource extraction at its most violent. Raiding meant acquiring wealth, stealing livestock, seizing fertile land.
And enslavement meant free agricultural labor and social status.
Exactly.
The violence became opportunistic predation. Now, did these local emirs still use the religious difference as an excuse? Absolutely.
Because it was convenient.
The devil worshiper myth was incredibly useful. It meant that if you raided a Yazidi village, you wouldn't face backlash from the broader Muslim community because you were attacking an unprotected, stigmatized outgroup.
Right. No one was going to come to their defense.
Exactly. But the theology was merely a convenient mask for resource acquisition and power expansion. It wasn't driven by a genuine fear of spiritual contamination. It was driven by the desire for land and loot.
So what does this all mean for us analyzing this? It means the excuse keeps changing, but the target stays the exact same.
Yeah, that's the tragic pattern.
In the early days, the theological belief seemed to actually drive the exclusion. Under the Ottomans, the belief was used as an administrative tool for control. And in the 19th century, the belief was just a smokescreen for violent robbery.
And then the 20th century arrives.
Right. The Ottoman Empire falls, the modern state of Iraq is formed, and the excuse changes yet again.
The 20th century introduces the massive force of ethnic nationalism into the equation.
A whole new variable.
The early Iraqi state is engaged in this aggressive project of nation building. They are trying to forge a unified national identity out of deeply diverse populations, which creates a whole new pressure cooker for minorities.
Yeah.
During this era, we see the implementation of Arabization policies.
Let's break down what Arabization actually meant for the people living there. because it sounds like a dry bureaucratic term, but it was incredibly destructive.
Arabization was a systematic demographic engineering project. The state wanted to dilute minority concentrations.
Okay.
For the Yazidis, this meant the government forcibly confiscating their ancestral farmlands and giving them to Arab settlers. It meant changing the ancient Kurdish and Yazidi names of towns and landmarks to Arabic names.
Erasing their footprint.
Yes, and it meant forcing Yazidis to register their official ethnicity as Arab on government documents, effectively trying to erase their distinct cultural identity from the public record entirely.
So the narrative shifted from "you're spiritually wrong" to "you don't fit the genetic, ethnic, or cultural makeup of the modern nation-state we're trying to build."
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what we
Yeah.
are tracing over these centuries is a devastating feedback loop of escalation.
A feedback loop.
It is vital to understand that violence of this magnitude does not jump straight to genocide overnight. It was a slow, agonizing process.
It builds on itself.
Exactly. It started with mischaracterization that led to social othering that resulted in being stripped of legal protection, which opened the door to repeated, localized attacks and state discrimination.
Wow.
Each layer of prejudice, each century of raids, normalized their exclusion a little bit more. It made the next, more severe level of violence easier to justify to the public.
So the Yazidis were trapped in a system where their persecution became continually, reliably useful to whoever happened to be holding power.
Useful. That is the exact word.
That word is deeply chilling when you apply it to human suffering. But that utility reaches its absolute, horrifying apex in 2014.
It does.
The historical patterns we've been tracking finally mutated into their fully matured, industrialized form. We were talking about the genocide carried out by the Islamic State, ISIS, primarily targeting the Yazidi homeland in the Sinjar region of northern Iraq.
This is the moment where we see what happens when a deeply embedded, centuries-old stigma collides with the sudden, massive collapse of state authority. In August 2014, we witnessed total dehumanization executed with bureaucratic precision. ISIS didn't just attack the Yazidis, they explicitly labeled them as infidels, pagans, and subhuman entities.
Just stripping away all humanity.
Completely. And the outcomes were staggering and horrifying. The mass execution of thousands of men and older women, the systematic, institutionalized sexual slavery of thousands of young women and girls, and the forced conversion and militarization of young boys.
It's hard to even comprehend the scale.
Everything that came before, the theological myths, the social labels, the political isolation, it was suddenly weaponized on an industrial scale.
And when you look at the geography and the context of this specific vulnerability in the source material, it is heartbreaking. The Yazidis in Sinjar were geographically isolated in the mountains.
Right.
They were lightly defended by local forces who ultimately retreated.
Yeah.
And I want to emphasize this heavily because it shatters the illusion that violence is always a two-way street.
It rarely is.
The Yazidis posed absolutely zero military threat to ISIS or anyone else. They had no expansionist political agenda. They weren't trying to conquer neighboring lands. They were entirely focused on communal survival.
Yeah, yes.
They were not dangerous.
Yeah.
They were just exceptionally vulnerable.
That distinction between being a threat and being vulnerable is the key to understanding the trigger for the 2014 genocide.
Also,
It wasn't just that ancient hatred suddenly spontaneously boiled over. Mass violence requires very specific material conditions to ignite.
like the power vacuum you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. In this case, there was a massive power vacuum. The Syrian civil war had spilled over the borders, and the Iraqi state and military control completely collapsed in those northern regions.
Right.
When a state's monopoly on force disappears, extremist ideologies rush in to fill the void.
And when ISIS rushed in, they didn't treat the Yazidis the way they treated other groups they conquered, did they? They applied a very specific, twisted legal logic to them.
Right. ISIS operated under a warped, highly literalist interpretation of Islamic law. Under their hierarchy, Christians and Jews were considered people of the book.
Like the old dhimmi status.
Yes. This meant that while they were severely subjugated, forced to pay extortionate taxes, and treated as second-class citizens, they still possessed a theoretical category of protection. They were allowed to exist, albeit miserably.
Okay.
But because of that ancient lingering myth that Yazidis were devil worshippers and pagans, ISIS placed them completely outside the protected monotheist categories.
So no protections at all.
None. They use this theological classification as a legal loophole to justify an entire economy built on human trafficking and enslavement.
An economy.
Yes, they literally published pamphlets and religious decrees explaining why it was permissible to enslave Yazidi women, using theology to authorize a slave trade. It was moral disengagement manufactured on a mass bureaucratic scale.
It is absolutely sickening how bureaucratic they made it. Now, to ensure we are looking at this impartially and objectively, examining the mechanics of identity, the source notes that not all Yazidis globally experienced this apex of violence in Tom 14.
Yes, looking at the diaspora provides important comparative balance.
Right.
While the Yazidis in Sinjar faced a catastrophic genocide, Yazidi communities living in places like Armenia and Georgia experienced social discrimination, but they certainly did not face violence on the scale of ISIS.
Okay.
And the significant Yazidi diaspora communities living in Europe, particularly in Germany, faced typical immigrant social prejudices, but their lives were protected under the robust rule of law of those nations.
So the identity alone isn't what causes the genocide. You can be Yazidi in Germany and be relatively safe. You can be Yazidi in Sinjar and face annihilation.
Exactly.
The formula is the targeted identity plus the total collapse of state structures.
The same identity yields wildly different outcomes depending on the stability of the state and the specific ideology of the surrounding power structures. It proves that a vulnerable minority only faces total destruction when the structural, legal protections of a society completely fail.
Okay, I want to pull back from the chronological timeline for a
Yeah.
second and look at the actual anatomy of how a society pulls this off.
The structure of it.
Right. Because an atrocity of this scale doesn't happen just because a few leaders are angry. If you want to build a machine that can process human beings into victims on an industrial scale, the text outlines 3 essential layers.
Right.
You need a narrative, a system, and a justification. Let's start with the narrative layer, because this is where the seed is planted in the public consciousness.
The narrative layer is entirely about framing. How is the targeted group presented to the broader public? We've touched on the historical myths, but in modern contexts, the Yazidis were framed not merely as people with different beliefs, but as spiritually and culturally polluted.
Polluted. That's a strong word.
It is. Framing a group as impure, or framing them as a contagion, is a terrifyingly effective psychological tool.
Because it triggers disgust.
Exactly. It bypasses logic and presses our most primal emotional buttons of disgust and moral panic. When a group is successfully framed as spiritually or biologically contaminated, excluding them or even harming them doesn't feel cruel to the perpetrators.
It feels hygienic.
Yes, it feels hygienic. It feels like sweeping dirt out of a house or cutting a tumor out of a body.
That is such a dark psychological pivot. Like,
Yeah.
we aren't murdering our neighbors, we are purifying the earth.
Precisely.
Okay, so you establish the narrative of impurity. But how does that prejudice go from a private thought, a citizen sitting in their house feeling disgusted, to a public, organized policy? That brings us to the system layer.
The system layer is the process of normalization and administration. Prejudice only becomes a physical threat when it is socially organized.
So institutions.
Exactly. ISIS didn't just rile up angry mobs to run through the streets. They built institutions. They turned deep-seated stigma into literal administration.
How so? Like, what did that look like?
They created logistics for separating families. They set up physical markets for human trafficking, complete with price registries, medical checks, and transport buses.
Oh my God, price registries.
Yes, it was fully bureaucratized. They established indoctrination camps to transfer children and erase their identities. Militias and institutional structures took the abstract stigma and translated it into rewarded action.
Rewarded action.
Right. If a fighter participated in the system, they were materially rewarded. They were given stolen land, looted wealth, elevated social status, and enslaved human beings. The system made participation profitable.
So you have the narrative telling you they're impure and the system rewarding you for acting on it. And then you have the final piece, the justification layer.
The justification layer is the mechanism that provides ultimate permission. It is the false logic used to soothe any lingering human conscience.
How do they justify it to themselves?
The internal logic goes like this. These people are spiritually deviant. Because they are deviant, they are inherently dangerous to our pure society. Therefore, the normal rules of human decency and the normal moral protections simply do not apply to them.
Wow.
It takes theological accusations and turns them into a blank check for atrocity. It removes the psychological burden of guilt.
It's almost like a corrupted computer operating system.
How so?
Well, the narrative layer is the virus, right? It's the malicious code that tricks the computer into believing a perfectly good functional file is actually corrupted and dangerous.
Okay, I see that.
The justification layer is that little pop-up window that appears on your screen asking, are you sure you want to permanently delete this file? You have administrative permission to proceed.
Right.
And then the system layer is the actual hard drive spinning up, executing the command, and wiping the data completely clean.
That's a highly effective way to visualize how these distinct parts interact. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of human behavior, the profound philosophical insight here is that people do not actually need to be physically afraid of someone to harm them.
Right, we always assume fear is the trigger.
We assume that fear is the primary root of all violence, a preemptive strike against a threat. But this history argues that perceived fear is often just a manufactured moral permission slip.
Interesting.
People don't need to be afraid. They just need a justification that makes the harm feel orderly, acceptable, and righteous.
That is staggering to think about. You don't need to be terrified of someone to destroy them. You just need a really good excuse that society agrees on.
Exactly.
That leads us perfectly into looking at the individuals who make up this machine.
Yeah.
If the narrative, system, and justification are the hardware, who are the cogs turning inside of it?
Right, the actor.
Who actually participates in this violence and why? Because it is incredibly lazy and frankly dangerous to just dismiss them all as a monolith of evil cartoon villains.
It is entirely counterproductive to just label them all evil because doing so teaches us nothing about how to prevent it. When we break down the perpetrators, whether within ISIS or historical Ottoman forces or 19th century tribal raiders, we see very distinct psychological profiles at work.
Okay, let's go through them.
First, you have the true believers. These are the ideological architects, the leadership, and the religious enforcers. They fully commit to the extremist doctrine.
So they actually buy into the narrative.
They truly believe they are enforcing a divine order by eliminating the Yazidis. In their own minds, they aren't the villains of the story. They are the righteous heroes correcting a corrupted world.
Okay, so that's the zealots at the top.
Yeah.
But an army needs a lot of foot soldiers, and they aren't all theologians. That's where you get the opportunists.
Yes. The opportunists are driven almost entirely by profit and personal gain. They are the frontline fighters engaging in looting, the people managing the slave markets, the local neighbors who suddenly turn on their friends to steal their property. They aren't necessarily ideologically deep. They might not even fully understand the theology. For them, the violence is simply a brutal economic vehicle to gain wealth, acquire real estate, and elevate their social status.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you magically stripped away the religious ideology tomorrow, the true believers might stop what they are doing.
Probably, yeah.
But the opportunists, they would likely still participate in the violence because it pays. If the system offers a free house, stolen cars, and free labor, the opportunist doesn't care what religion the victim practices.
Exactly.
The motivation is greed, not God.
Exactly. And next, you have a layer above the foot soldiers, the power seekers. These are the mid-level commanders, the local strongmen, the warlords.
What do they want?
Their primary motivation is dominance, authority, and maintaining territorial control. They use violence as a political tool to enforce their rule. For them, the extremist ideology is just the required language they must speak to maintain their grip on power, rather than a deeply held spiritual conviction.
Then you get to the most tragic cogs in the entire machine, the fearful followers.
The fearful followers are the ordinary civilians, the low-level recruits, the people swept up in the momentum who participate mainly to survive.
Just trying not to get killed themselves.
Exactly. They suppress their own moral compass and conform because they are under the immediate threat of violence from their own side. If they refuse to execute a prisoner or refuse to join the militia, they themselves will be killed as traitors.
Right.
Their participation is not about belief or profit. It is entirely about fear management and self-preservation.
And finally, rounding out the ecosystem of atrocity, you have the passive bystanders, the neighbors who close their blinds, the external actors who just watch it happen on the news.
The enablers.
Right. They calculate the personal risk of intervening, adopt a strict, not my problem mindset, and allow the psychological diffusion of responsibility to keep them paralyzed. So looking at this incredibly diverse cast of characters, I have to ask, how on earth do you stop a machine like this if everyone inside it is running on a totally different type of fuel?
This raises what might be the most important strategic question of all. The reality is, You cannot stop an opportunist by appealing to their conscience with a moral argument about human rights.
Because they only care about their profit margins.
Exactly. You cannot stop a fearful follower by threatening them with international economic sanctions because they're acting out of an immediate physical terror of a gun to their head.
Right.
And you certainly cannot stop a true believer by offering them economic incentives or jobs.
So what's the solution?
The critical insight here is that different engines require entirely different interventions. If we lazily group them all as mindless evil, we apply one-size-fits-all solutions that are doomed to fail. We miss the specific leverage points: financial disruption for the opportunists, physical protection for the fearful followers, ideological counter-narratives for the believers. That's what is required to actually dismantle the system.
That is a very bleak but incredibly necessary realization about human nature. Okay, let's dig even deeper into the psychology of this. If the opportunists are just in it for the money, that explains the foot soldiers. But it doesn't explain the architects.
Right.
What is broken in the psychology of a dominant group that makes them feel this deep structural need to invent a monster in the first place? What internal void in the oppressor's mind does persecuting the Yazidis actually fill?
The analysis here cuts very deep, identifying 3 core psychological problems that persecuting a minority solves for a dominant group.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, it is a mechanism for symbolizing fear. As we discussed earlier, the Yazidis symbolized ambiguity and crossed traditional boundaries.
Because of their insularity and different beliefs.
Right. If a dominant group cannot clearly understand or neatly categorize a minority within their borders, it triggers a profound subconscious fear of disorder. The violence is an aggressive, desperate attempt to enforce cognitive simplification.
Cognitive simplification.
It is an attempt to force a complex, messy, nuanced world into a very simple, manageable binary: us versus them.
So they're literally using violence to forcibly organize their own worldview. That's the first problem. What else does it solve for them?
Group cohesion. Human groups bond incredibly quickly and tightly when faced with an external threat. By constructing a shared, terrifying enemy, the imaginary devil worshiper, the dominant group massively strengthens its own internal identity.
Nothing brings people together like a shared enemy.
Exactly. It creates a powerful, unifying in-group dynamic and provides them with a false but deeply satisfying sense of moral superiority. The logic is simple. If they are the impure, demonic outgroup, then by definition, we must be the pure, righteous, chosen ones.
And the third psychological problem.
Deflection, avoiding uncomfortable truths.
Oh, this is a big one.
Ruling empires, failing states, and terrorist caliphates all share a common problem. They are often failing to provide for their people. By focusing all of the public's aggressive energy on targeting a vulnerable minority like the Yazidis, the aggressors avoid having to look at their own political fragmentation.
Right.
They avoid looking at their own failing economies, their internal instability, or the glaring moral contradictions of their own rule. It is always historically much easier to direct public anger at a scapegoat than to engage in honest institutional introspection.
That makes perfect sense. You point the finger outward so nobody looks at the massive cracks in your own foundation.
Yeah.
You give the angry public a target so they don't target you.
Exactly.
There is an identity mechanism mentioned in the text regarding this dynamic that I really want to unpack. What happens to a society when the dominant group's entire identity becomes anchored to opposing another group?
That is the ultimate trap, and it is the most dangerous mechanism of all. It happens in stages. First, the society defines the outgroup as merely different. Then they moralize that difference. They say, because you are different, you are wrong. Then they essentialize it. You are inherently genetically or spiritually wrong, and you can never be fixed.
Yeah.
But the final fatal step is when the dominant group attaches its own core identity to that opposition. They begin to say, the definition of who we are is that we are the ones who oppose them.
Wow.
Once a group defines its own existence by its opposition to a minority, violence against that minority becomes the ultimate proof of loyalty to the state or the religion.
Oh, wow. So the violence isn't even about the victim anymore. It's about proving you belong to the in-group. If you suddenly stop being violent toward the minority, your own people will view you as a traitor.
Exactly. Stopping the violence or even just calling for tolerance means risking your own belonging, your status, and your physical safety within the dominant group.
So you're locked in.
The opposition is no longer just an optional policy that can be debated. It becomes the mandatory maintenance of their own identity. The persecutory machine becomes entirely self-sustaining.
That is utterly terrifying to contemplate. Now, I want to pivot hard here, because if we spend this entire time only talking about the psychology of the persecutors and the mechanics of the violence, we are falling into the exact trap we want to avoid.
Right, erasing the victims.
Exactly. We end up defining the Yazidis solely by their victimization, which strips them of their agency. We absolutely need to talk about their historical resilience, and we need to definitively debunk some massive, lingering myths about their culture that still float around today.
Yes, it is crucial to address this. Outsiders often look at persecuted groups and develop highly distorted views of them. First, there is the persistent colonial-era idea that the Yazidis are somehow culturally backward, primitive, or uneducated.
Which is just not true.
This is fundamentally false. They possess a deeply rich, highly complex philosophical and religious tradition that has navigated centuries of theological debate. The unfamiliarity that outsiders feel isn't because the Yazidis are primitive, it is simply ethnocentrism.
Judging them by our own standards.
Right. The tendency to judge another culture entirely by the standards of one's own culture, disguised as an objective evaluation.
Another insidious myth is the idea that, well, they are perpetual victims because they are inherently weak.
That is a terrible analytical flaw, confusing the outcome with the cause. The Yazidis have faced dozens of targeted massacres, often referred to in their history as the 74 genocides, or famines.
74.
The fact that the Yazidi identity, religion, and culture have survived centuries of relentless, overwhelming imperial pressure and an industrialized genocide is proof of incredible, almost unimaginable cultural endurance and structural resilience.
Yeah, surviving that takes immense strength.
They are not victims because they are weak. They were targeted because they were vulnerable, and they survived because they are remarkably strong.
And what about their insularity? You often hear people say, well, they are incredibly closed off. They don't let anyone in. They must be hostile or hiding something.
This is a classic misinterpretation of survival tactics. Their closed community structure, and specifically their practice of endogamy, which means they strictly marry only within their own religious community, is not an act of hostility toward the outside world.
It's just self-preservation.
It is a highly adaptive, deeply necessary protective response. When your population numbers are constantly threatened by forced conversions and massacres, marrying within the group is a way to ensure the cultural and religious continuity of the next generation.
Right.
Defensive behavior adopted by a traumatized minority is routinely, tragically reinterpreted by ignorant outsiders as offensive intent.
And today, in the aftermath of 2014, we are seeing that historical resilience taking on very modern organized forms. After the state completely failed to protect them, the Yazidis didn't just fade away, they began organizing on a global scale.
They've been incredibly active.
You have vital advocacy groups like Yazda, which has been tirelessly documenting the genocide, collecting evidence for international courts, and supporting survivors on the ground.
Yes, crucial work.
You have the Free Yazidi Foundation, providing culturally sensitive trauma rehabilitation and advocating for legal rights. You have Nadia's Initiative, founded by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Nadia Murad, which does incredible work bridging the lived experience of survivors with high-level global policy to literally rebuild the infrastructure of Sinjar.
It's amazing what they are doing.
And you have the Yazidi Supreme Spiritual Council working to maintain theological and cultural continuity through all of this upheaval.
What is truly vital to observe about these modern organizations and the modern Yazidi response in general is the fundamental nature of their organization. It is true that after the state failed them in 2014, Yazidis formed local armed defense groups, such as the Sinjar resistance units, to protect their own families when no one else would.
Right, but I noticed a massive glaring contrast when reading about these groups in the document. These armed militias are strictly defensive and they are intensely localized.
Very localized.
They were there to guard checkpoints and protect villages. Even after enduring unimaginable trauma, the Yazidi community never produced extremist, expansionist, or retaliatory global terrorist movements.
Precisely. And this fact alone thoroughly and completely debunks any insidious victim-blaming arguments that try to suggest the Yazidis somehow provoked their persecution through internal extremism.
They just didn't.
They have no global ideological movement. They have no missionary expansion trying to convert others. There is no systemic Yazidi violence driving instability in the region.
The distinction is so clear. Groups that are built on an ideology of conquest create power structures designed to dominate others. But groups that are built on a foundation of survival create support structures designed to heal and protect.
That is a powerful point.
It's such a definitive distinction.
It is the ultimate structural insight. It proves beyond any doubt that the horrific violence committed against them was entirely manufactured by the internal political and psychological needs of the oppressors, and was in no way provoked by the actions or the nature of the victims.
We are coming toward the end of our deep dive, and we need to look at what remains after the machine runs its course. The legacy layer. What is the reality for the Yazidi people right now?
It's still very difficult.
There has been a significant shift in the global narrative, right? Major international bodies, like the United Nations, various national parliaments, and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, now officially recognize the 2014 atrocities not just as a tragedy, but specifically as a genocide.
That official recognition is legally and historically important. It changes the public narrative from a vague sectarian tragedy of war to the targeted, intentional destruction of a protected group.
Right.
However, we must be unflinching about the grim reality on the ground today. Public recognition and international declarations have not rebuilt homes.
Words don't build houses.
Exactly. The legacy of 2014 is ongoing. There are still mass graves being discovered and painstakingly exhumed in northern Iraq. Over a decade later, hundreds of thousands of Yazidis remain stuck in internally displaced persons camps, living in tents.
It's unbelievable.
There are immense, complex structural barriers, including lack of security and lack of basic infrastructure, preventing their safe return to Sinjar.
And there is deeply incomplete justice. While some ISIS fighters have been tried for terrorism charges, very few perpetrators have been held specifically accountable for the crime of genocide or the organized sexual enslavement of the Yazidi people in international courts.
Right.
It is that awful, recurring reality of history where public memory outruns actual material repair.
To synthesize everything we've unpacked today, the history of the Yazidi people reveals a dark truth about human systems. The Yazidis weren't hated because they were clearly understood and found to be dangerous. They were hated because they were misunderstood in ways that were highly brutally useful to those holding power.
Useful. There's that word again.
Whether it was the Ottoman Empire seeking administrative control and tax revenue, 19th century tribal leaders seeking wealth and land, or ISIS seeking an enslavement economy to reward their fighters and an outgroup to unify their ranks. In every era, the Yazidis were framed as a permissible victim class to fuel the ambitions of the dominant group.
Which brings me back to the very reason we started this exploration. We talked at the beginning about how tempting it is to look at history, point at the perpetrators and say, look at those evil monsters, driven by pure, irrational religious hatred.
Right.
But peeling back the layers of this machine leaves us with a haunting, profound question to consider. And I really want you, the listener, to think about the mechanics we've discussed today. If you magically removed ideology entirely from the equation.
Just took it completely out.
Exactly. If you took away all the religious labels, the historical myths, and the spiritual justifications, how much of the world's violence would still happen anyway?
Because if the answer is a lot, and when we look closely at the opportunists looting for profit, and the power seekers destroying lives just to maintain their authority, it likely is, then the real fundamental driver of human atrocity isn't belief at all.
It's simply opportunity, wearing belief as a convenient mask.
It is the persecutory machine constantly searching for its fuel.
Thank you for joining us on this intense, incredibly important deep dive. I hope taking apart this machine piece by piece encourages you to question the clean, binary narratives you encounter in the world. Look past the surface excuses, examine who profits from the prejudice, and always search for the hidden incentives hiding just behind the public outrage. Until next time.